busy. His project at the moment is working on editing the original writings of Saul Plaatje for publication for the what used to be the Van Riebeeck Society of South Africa. So and by the way, let me just mention that the edited collection with Janet Remington and Baker Seasby Peterson was winner of the 2018 award from the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. So let us welcome him.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for coming along. I think we have an hour, and I think what I'll aim to do is to speak for perhaps 50 minutes, and then we see if we can have 10 minutes at the end of that. So this is the first of 3 lectures, and the purpose really is to provide a context for looking at I suppose the 2 things that Saul Plaatje is best known for, as a political leader and spokesman, and as a writer, an important literary figure. So this lecture is about Plaatje's life. I think fascinating in its own right, but something that does provide the essential context for an understanding of his political and later his literary concerns, and of how he managed to achieve the preeminence and the reputation that he did. But I also want in this lecture to pay particular attention to Plaatje's early life. And partly this is because I think his later life comes out a bit more in my next lectures, where the focus is on his career as a political figure and as a writer. But partly because he inculcated, as a young man, some ideas which did leave a profoundly important mark on his thinking. And I think it's important that we should have a good idea of that. But I think partly also because, thanks to a rich archival record, it's actually possible to do so for Plaatje in a way that it's not for most of his contemporaries. So while Plaatje's life was his alone, there is a sense in which I think it's legitimate to see his life as standing for many others whose story can't be told so fully. So let me start with Saul Plaatje's name, or names, which has often puzzled people. And it's actually quite a good way, I think, into his diverse and rather interesting family background. So, Solomon Tekisho Plaatje. I mean, Solomon, first of all, obviously a biblical name, signifying wisdom from the Bible. Both Plaatje's parents, in fact his grandparents, were Christians, products really of the kind of 19th century period of missionary evangelization. They had contact with several different missionary organizations, the London Missionary Society, the Wesleyan Missionary Society, and interestingly enough, it was when they had some contact with the Wesleyans that Plaatje's grandfather was actually baptized by Olive Schreiner's father, Gottlob Schreiner. So there was quite an interesting connection with the Schreiners there, which was then replicated a bit later on in life. But latterly, the Plaatje family were adherents of the Berlin Missionary Society, the German-speaking Berlin Missionary Society. And by the time Saul Plaatje was born, they had actually become quite prominent figures within the society and at the mission where they had ended up, which was the mission at Botany in the Orange Free State. So in fact the name that he was given actually initially wasn't Solomon, it was Salomo, which is the German form of the name, but then anglicized to Solomon. And then the second name, Tekisho. This is a Tswana word, they were Tswana speaking, and its meaning is judgment. And what it signified, according to the family traditions which were told to me, was that it signified acceptance acceptance of God's will, in that Plaatje's mother had a lot of boys so far, and she actually wanted a girl, but God's will that it was going to be another boy. So this was her acceptance of his decision. Linked also to another Tswana word, Itzakisa, meaning purity or purification. And this was a slightly kind of alternative version that was put to me. And this signified repentance for having presumed to anticipate God's will. But either way, I think the name was a kind of badge in Setswana of the family's identity as Barolong. Tswana speakers who had a particular history and set of traditions. They were actually Barolong Baka Modibor, descended from the founder of the Barolong nation. And they were actually distinctive in that they claimed to have remained loyal to the founder of the nation. And they didn't then become part of the later subdivisions, the sub-chieftains of the Barolong, like the Rachidi, the Raklu, the Rapulana. So there was always that sense in the Plaatje family tradition of being loyal to their chief. But there were also plenty of tales of suffering at the hands of Mzilikazi and Ndebele in the early 19th century, of their alliance with the Boer trekkers who arrived in the 1830s, who allied against Mzilikazi, but then their betrayal as the Boers failed to keep their side of the bargain and laid claim to the land that ended up becoming known essentially as the Orange Free State. So I think all of these family traditions are central to an understanding of where Plaatje came from. And in a way there was a kind of double sense of dispossession. I think first of all, his family, there was a sense of having been dispossessed from the true line of descent, and secondly, a sense of dispossession by the Boers. And then thirdly, the name Plaatje, a Dutch name meaning flat, and it actually came from, again according to the family traditions, it came from Dutch-speaking Griqua in Philippolis in the 1840s and 1850s. And interesting, some members of the family preferred to stick to the family name Mhudi, but one branch, the Plaatje's branch, became Plaatje's, and I think we're always very happy and proud to keep that name. So all three names were then recorded in the Berlin Missionary Society Register at Bethany after Plaatje was born on the 9th of October 1876. And just to give you a sense of the geography of all of this, the Bethany Mission down the kind of bottom right, Bloemfontein a bit further to the north, and then Kimberley, Berkeley West further to the northwest. Now, after Bethany, Plaatje's parents decided to move on to another of the Berlin Society's mission, the one at Pineal, and that's also marked on the map. You can see it there, near Berkeley West, on the south side of the Vaal River. And it was here, he said later, that he spent the happiest years of his childhood. And here is a picture of the Pineal Mission. I don't know whether Plaatje is actually one of the people in that picture, but it gives you an idea of the church, and you can just about see the Vaal River in the background. I think that must have been early 1890s when Plaatje was actually there. Now, I think these mission stations, certainly in this part of the world, did provide a haven for some African groups and families. And from the mission records, it's clear that the Plaatje family did prosper. And they built up quite large herds of cattle and other livestock. But it also brought young Plaatje into contact with Ernst Westfall, one of the two missionaries at Pineal, and his wife, Marie Westfall. And here they are. Extremely important people in his life. And it was obvious from a fairly early stage that he was the star pupil in the mission school that the Westfalls ran. And young Solomon, so Westfall wrote in June 1892, when Plaatje would have been 15, was the most talented sighted pupil he taught in his 11 years at the mission, and he could speak and read Dutch and English with ease. He had a talent for music, and he also taught himself to play the violin, and also was reported to have often helped the missionaries in their interpreting work. But there was a problem, and the problem was that the school could only go up to standard 3. So to address this, the Westfalls then gave young Plaatje some additional private tuition while he became a pupil teacher, combining his studies with being an assistant teacher in the classroom. And in fact, it was Marie Westfall who was mostly providing this extra tuition because her husband became the superintendent of the mission, and I think just didn't have the time to do that. But unusually for a missionary wife, Marie Westfall was not only well educated herself, but had been a high school teacher in Germany before coming out to marry her husband. And I think very few missionary wives fell into that sort of category. So I think what you can see is a number of things falling into place to enable young Plaatje to flourish at the Pineal Mission. And I think, the other thing that kind of strikes me is that there is also a kind of randomness. The other thing I suppose that he had was some luck in being at the right place at the right time, but also rather more luck than some of his brothers, because in fact 3 of his brothers, after the family moved to Pineal, died of one cause or another. And I think Plaatje, obviously didn't suffer that fate. Now, central to life at Pineal, of course, was the Christian religion, which young Plaatje fully embraced. He was after being baptized, he was confirmed in 1892, and he would remain an adherent of the Lutheran Church for the rest of his life. So, an inherited identity and lived experience as a Moralong, and an upbringing on a German-run mission station, 2 vitally important formative influences. So after Pineal, Plaatje left in 1894 and he went to Kimberley. And the Westfalls, Plaatje wrote of them at the time, he said, had something mapped out for me which they could not quite define. I think it was some form of higher education. And it came as a terrible shock to them when I left the old mission by the way of the Cape Civil Service. And this was actually a job with the post office in Kimberley, about 18 miles away. And it was made possible not just by his own initiative, by the fact that the Kimberley post office had a particular reputation for employing blacks as messengers and letter carriers, mainly because I think they were rather better educated than the whites that they would have been able to have employed in their place. It was actually an initiative that had begun at Lovedale in 1880, and they sent a batch of employees to Kimberley, and these were the first batch. This is before Plaatje's time there, but about 2 or 3 of those people were still in Kimberley, I think, when Plaatje arrived to join them. So that was the uniform that they had as well. So this was, I think, an area where colonial society was opening up some admittedly limited opportunities for educated blacks in Plaatje's position. So again, I think you can see Plaatje happened to find himself in the right place at the right time, and was clearly keen himself to take full advantage of the opportunity that presented itself. Now, he was in Kimberley for about 4.5 years, and he was exposed to a rich social and cultural life, part of a mission-educated African community from all parts of southern Africa who'd made their home there. Clubs and societies flourished, and it provided a forum for entertainment, for sport, for music making, discussion, and for self-improvement. Remember, we're in the late Victorian era. So take, for example, the South Africans Improvement Society. It was formed in 1895, and its objectives, according to its secretary, were firstly to cultivate the use of the English language which is foreign to Africans. Secondly, to help each other by fair and reasonable criticism in readings, recitations, English compositions, etc. So English in the late 19th century Cape Colony was the language you needed if you wanted to get on, and Plaatje was soon involved. On the 16th of July 1895, he read out a chapter from a book called John Bull and Co., for which his style of reading and pronunciation was fairly criticised. And a month later, he read an essay entitled The History of the Botswanas. Being a Botswana, the secretary of this society reported, he showed great mastery over his subject. And then there was Shakespeare. I had but a vague idea of Shakespeare until about 1896, when at the age of 18 I was attracted by the press remarks in the Kimberley paper and went to see Hamlet in the Kimberley Theatre. Actually, it wasn't 1896. It was December 1897, but this is the performance, because there was actually only one performance of Hamlet in Kimberley at that time. It was put on by a travelling company that had come from England. And for Plaatje, I think it was really the beginning of a lifelong fascination with Shakespeare, leading eventually to his project to translate a number of Shakespeare's plays into Setswana. And worth noting that at this time in Kimberley, at least one of the more liberal places in the colony, there was nothing to stop Plaatje and his friends from going to the theatre, along with what was usually a predominantly white audience, or indeed from hiring venues like the town hall for their own functions. And just to show you the inside of the Kimberley Theatre, it's a rather splendid place. It actually had a reputation of being one of the best theatres in southern Africa, until I think it was burnt down in about 1930 or so. But a pretty impressive place. And I think just worth remembering that that things certainly did change later, even in Kimberley. But at this time, Plaatje and his friends were able to go to the theatre and various other kind of musical entertainments, which were shared with blacks and whites. Now, Plaatje's time in Kimberley was a training ground in politics too. For black South Africans like Plaatje, the Cape Colony in the late 19th century held out the possibility of inclusion and citizenship. The Cape had a non-racial constitution dating back to 1853. It promised equality before the law, and the franchise was open to all that is who were male, over 21, who met a very basic literacy qualification, and who owned property worth £75 or had an annual income of an equivalent amount, which Plaatje, I think, reached in 1897. So general elections were for black and white alike, and in some constituencies, such as Berkeley West, which included the Pineal Mission station, candidates had to appeal to black and coloured voters if they wanted to get elected. And this is actually what led to Cecil Rhodes, the member of the House of Assembly for Berkeley West, to come up with his famous slogan of equal rights for all civilised men south of the Zambezi, in place of equal rights for all white men, when he was in need of black and coloured votes. And just to show you a rather interesting picture of black and coloured voters, I think, surrounding the polling desk in Berkeley West in 1898. And I think it's always a kind of a reminder, if you say to people, when were the first non-racial elections in South Africa? Well, 1994. Well, actually, there was a much longer history in the Cape Colony, and I think here is kind of photographic evidence of that. And there were local issues too that engaged the attention of Plaatje and his friends in Kimberley, like the pass laws. When they wished to challenge the ways in which the municipal authorities and the police tried to extend their reach and to further control their freedom of movement, they took on a lawyer, a man called Henry Burton, and they brought a case they brought their case on appeal to the Greek Willan West High Court, and they won. And Plaatje later regarded this as a famous victory, and he, in fact, often referred to it later in life. So I think when we consider and think of Plaatje's support for the Cape franchise, his belief in the law, and the importance that he attached later in life to using legal methods as a means to redress grievances, you can see how this was informed by some of his earlier experiences. And this was just one example. And sometimes, of course, they did win, as in this case. Now, Plaatje's time in Kimberley was significant for personal reasons too. It was here that he met his future wife, Elizabeth Mbele, the youngest sister of his best friend, Isaiah Mbele, who was interpreter to the Greek Willan West High Court, and a leading light in Kimberley's African community. And here is both Elizabeth on one side, and then Mbele standing on the far side on the right, and Plaatje also standing. So I think a wonderful picture. I think it was actually taken a few years later in Mafikeng, that picture, but it's very much from the period that we're talking about. Now, Elizabeth was of Mfengu origin. She was a teacher at the Anglican Mission School in Stainsburg, which is about, I think, 200 miles from Kimberley. Neither sets of parents approved of the liaison, but it didn't deter them, and once Elizabeth reached her 21st birthday, they were free to get married anyway, and that's exactly what they did in January 1898. And it was the beginning of a happy marriage that would produce 6 children, and the first of them, St. Ledger, being born in November 1898. And it was actually a very romantic affair, which Plaatje did then subsequently write about, I think very amusingly. Now, after Kimberley, in 1898, Plaatje moved to Mafikeng, about 200 miles to the north, to take up a job as a court interpreter. Now, it's important to I think understand that amongst black South Africans particularly, there was widespread recognition of the importance of the role of the court interpreter in the administration of justice, in making a reality of the colony's claim that every citizen was equal before the law. And so it was a prestigious and highly sought after job. In the rural areas, and I'm quoting here, an interpreter in the magistrate's office was considered second only in importance to the magistrate. Well, that was not Plaatje talking, although it might have been, but former President Nelson Mandela, writing in Long Walk to Freedom. And it was about the time, some 30 years later, when he was himself preparing to take an interpreting course at the Heeltown Institution in the Eastern Cape. And I think his description was just as true then, if not more so, than in Plaatje's day. And Mandela obviously went on to do other things than court interpreting. And we do know that these were views of court interpreting very much shared by Plaatje, because he then wrote about himself in a very interesting piece called The Essential Interpreter. Now, Mafikeng was not the place to be if you wanted a quiet life. On Plaatje's 23rd birthday, 9th of October 1899, war broke out between Britain and the Boer republics, and Mafikeng, long lined up as a target, was surrounded by Boer forces and then besieged for 7 months. Now, Plaatje came through it safe and sound, although he did have a few narrow escapes, but he was kept very busy interpreting not only for the magistrate and the British staff officers, but in supplying them with military intelligence. His job was to brief and debrief the African spies and runners who went backwards and forwards through the Boer lines, and then to write up their accounts of what they'd seen and where they had been. And there's actually quite an interesting photograph showing him doing exactly that. In getting news, I think according to the caption, of the relief of Kimberley in early 1900. And I think it's just interesting in the way that the picture's set up. you can see Plaatje, I think, really the central figure in the whole business of two people communicating who wouldn't be able to otherwise. Now, several of the reports that Plaatje wrote, interestingly enough, appeared in the daily Mafikeng Mail Siege edition. And what seemed to have happened was that Baden-Powell, the British commander, passed on some of them once he'd looked at them for publication if he thought they were giving nothing away and were likely to have a good effect on morale. And here is just one example. The section under the heading Native Reports is basically Plaatje's reports, although there's never in any of this any indication that Plaatje was the person who wrote them. Now, more famous today, of course, is the personal diary which Plaatje wrote in English, and I'll have more to say about that in my final lecture. And after the siege, well, Plaatje remained in his job as clerk and court interpreter until 1902. He was clearly keen to get on, and he took some further civil service examinations. But even with these extra qualifications, I think he soon realised that racial barriers in the Cape Civil Service would prevent him from getting any further. However able, experienced, or well qualified you were, if you were black, you had no chance of rising through the ranks, let alone becoming a magistrate or an assistant magistrate. But Plaatje certainly learned a lot, I think, from his time in Mafikeng, and he put this to good use later in life. He became very knowledgeable about the workings of the judicial system and how this could be used. His intelligence summaries during the war and his diary honed his skills as a writer, and court interpreting and translation gave him an excellent grounding in how to render one language and culture comprehensible to another, and the confidence and expertise, as he acknowledged later, to embark upon the task of translating Shakespeare into Setswana. So 1902, at the end of the war, a Treaty of Vereniging, and a new phase also in Plaatje's life. It began in 1902 when he resigned from the Cape Civil Service to take up the position of editor of Koeranta ya Botswana, or the Botswana Gazette. This was the point at which Plaatje entered public life, so it was an important moment. Koeranta was a Setswana English weekly newspaper. It was modelled on Imvo Tsapansundu, the Xhosa English paper edited by John Tangu Chubavu, and it was financed by Silas Molema, a wealthy Barolong chief in Mafikeng, with whom Plaatje was very closely associated. And there's a wonderful photograph of the staff of Koeranta ya Botswana, a little bit damaged on the right-hand side, as you can see, but sitting in the front, you can see Plaatje himself, and at the end, Silas Molema holding, I'm not quite sure what he's holding up in his hand, but I think it was something of which the entire community, black community in Mafikeng, were extremely proud. Now, the aim of Koeranta ya Botswana was to educate and to enlighten, to represent Barolong interests and African interests more generally, and to be a means of communication between government and people. And remember, this was a time when the British planned to reshape South Africa in the aftermath of the war. So Plaatje and others like him had every reason, every incentive, I think, to make their voices heard. And there did now seem to be a window of opportunity to enable them to do so at just the time that Plaatje entered public life. Now, after a few years, Koeranta ya Botswana got into financial difficulties, and there were long periods when no issue appeared. And both Plaatje and Molema got heavily into debt, and in the end, the newspaper and all its assets had to be sold off. But for a while, Plaatje, still in Mafikeng, had to work as a labour recruiter, supplying labourers to the coal mines in the Transvaal. And I think it was probably a low point in his life. And he'd in fact be pursued by his creditors for quite a few years to come. But he obviously had to find some way of making an income. So Union of South Africa, 1910. This brought together the hitherto separate colonies into a unitary state, but it left black South Africans in a very exposed position. The franchise survived in the Cape Colony, or Cape Province as it now became, but it was not extended elsewhere to the other colonies. And it was largely, I think, an awareness of this vulnerability that led a group of leading black landowners in Tabanchu, in the Free State, to join together to form a syndicate to start a new newspaper, Tsala ya Bechuana, or the newspaper of the Bechuana, with Plaatje as its editor, and based in Kimberley. And this provided the platform to enable Plaatje to emerge as one of the leading black spokesmen of the day. And at its height, it reached a circulation of around 4,000 copies a week, quite an achievement, I think. And a reminder of Plaatje's importance as a pioneer in the history of the press, which I think sometimes gets a bit forgotten when we think of his political role and his literary role as well. At the same time, Plaatje became involved in moves towards founding a new national political organisation, the South African Native National Congress, in 1912, and he became its first General Secretary. A year later, the Native Land Act of 1913, its biggest challenge so far. Now, I'll have more to say about both of these things in my lecture tomorrow, but I mention them here in order to explain the trajectory of Plaatje's life over the next few years, because essentially it was driven by these developments. When the Congress failed in their representations about the Land Act to the South African authorities, they decided to take their case to London, to lay their case before the British Imperial government. But there was no joy there either, and so when war broke out in August 1914, the delegates still there, the Congress decided to recall the 5 delegates, Plaatje being amongst them, to South Africa, believing that no more could be done. But Plaatje, the Secretary of the Deputation, decided to stay on, and it was quite a, I think, critical decision that he made. He was writing his book about the Land Act, and he wanted to see it published, convinced that there was a chance of influencing public opinion. He managed to raise the money that he needed, because he actually had to pay the publisher, through mobilising a band of supporters and sympathisers, particularly a group of women with quite strong South African connections who'd made their home in London. They included, and here they are, Georgiana Solomon, widow of Saul Solomon, well-known Cape parliamentarian, Alice Werner, who was a lecturer in African languages at King's College in London, and Sophie Colenso, who's the one sort of behind the piano in the photograph, who was a daughter-in-law of the famous bishop. And I think these were really the band of supporters that essentially enabled Plaatje to achieve his objective. And he was also supported by the Brotherhoods, which was an interdenominational religious movement, which essentially believed in applying the Christian gospel to daily life. Now, 2 years later, in 1919, Plaatje was back in England, this time as the leader of a second Congress deputation. The British government was no more open to persuasion on that occasion than before. But rather than return home, though, Plaatje again stayed on, intending to travel to the United States if he could, but also to complete the historical novel, Mhudi, which he wrote in London in 1920. Well, after that, he did get to the US via Canada, in fact overcoming the attempts of the South African authorities to stop him going by denying him a passport. His aim was to bring the case of black South Africans to the American public, especially the African American public, to support himself and his family by selling his books over there, and also to raise funds for his Brotherhood organisation, which he'd set up in South Africa. So back in England, 1922, sort of on his way back, he tried without success to raise the money that he required to publish an African language version of the Brotherhood hymn book. He accompanied a Swazi deputation on their travels around London, and he got a job working on the presentation of a wildlife film called The Cradle of the World at a London theatre. And here it is. It was actually a film, but in the interval, they had a kind of dramatic presentation in which Plaatje participated, and he was in fact paid to kind of organise the whole thing. The problem was he failed, despite all of this, to raise the money for his fare back home, which was his main objective. In the end, he had to rely on the help of Mrs. Solomon to bail him out, and he finally returned home to South Africa and to Kimberley late in 1923, very heavily in debt. So it was actually quite I think, a complicated narrative, certainly rather more complicated than a kind of version that you tend to get with the histories of the ANC. So then, for the remaining 9 years of Plaatje's life, he died in 1932, with any form of external intervention in South Africa no longer a possibility. He had no choice but to make the best of the situation that he came back to. But he did so in some quite interesting ways. First of all, he made a living as a journalist, not as the editor of his own newspaper, which was always what he was trying to do, but he could never raise the funds for this, but as a contributor to the daily and weekly press in South Africa, and for both black-run and white-run newspapers. He was a regular visitor to the Visitors' Gallery of the House of Assembly here in Cape Town, and reporting on its proceedings. He wrote obituaries, he wrote travel pieces, as well as articles on the political issues of the day, and there were hundreds of them. But he also brought back from the United States a portable bioscope, along with a number of films, including one that showed the work of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, the kind of leading institute of black education in the southern states. And this became the centerpiece of the shows that he then put on and took with him on his travels in South Africa. It was his way, I think, of conveying to his audiences, especially audiences of children, the inspiration that he took from the self-help of African American communities in the United States. He called his bioscope, in fact, a veritable moving school. And here, just to show you, that gives you a bit of a flavour of it. This was when, I think 1924, when he was taking his bioscope on a tour around the country. And this was the leaflet that he prepared for the visit to Bloemfontein. And actually, quite interesting, there's been quite a lot of kind of interest from the film studies people in this, because it was a kind of pioneering effort. Thirdly, Plaatje became very involved in the work of the IOTT, which is the Independent Organisation of True Templars, which was a temperance organisation. And this was an issue that he'd been concerned about for a very long time. And he developed, in fact, quite a close relationship with a man called J.W. Mushet, who was the head of the order and a prominent Cape Town merchant. I think he actually ended up as a minister in the post-war Smuts government. And it's just a reminder, I think, that there was still, in the 1920s, a bit of a kind of Cape liberal establishment, people like Mushet, who were prepared to support Plaatje in his various ventures. And finally, Plaatje became a very passionate defender of the interests and integrity of Setswana, his mother tongue. He fought government attempts to reform orthographies, and he applied himself to the task of creating a written literature in Setswana. He felt, in fact, that Setswana's very existence was under threat, and he did all that he could to preserve it. And again, I've got a bit more about this to say in my third lecture. Now, what in all of this about Plaatje's family, you may have been wondering? Well, there was another narrative about all of this that I guess kind of ran alongside what Plaatje himself was doing. And I think it was his family relations that really, in many ways, made it all possible. So I wanted to say a little bit about Plaatje's wife and his family and the situation. Now, by the time Plaatje returned to South Africa in 1923, 2 of his children had died. a son called Johannes Gutenberg, so named because he was born on the day Plaatje began a new printing business in 1912, but also his daughter Olive, who had died in 1921 from the after effects of the influenza epidemic while Plaatje himself was away in America. So it was actually a desperately sad situation. And there's a picture of Olive. And Plaatje's novel Mhudi is actually dedicated to her. Now, Plaatje's wife Elizabeth, I think, had a pretty difficult time coping with his long absences from home. And there were those who felt that he had abandoned her to pursue not only a political cause, which she certainly very much supported too, but also his own literary and other ambitions that he wished to pursue in London and New York. And that's certainly what several of his English friends thought. And it's not difficult to see that living in London, where he did spend several years, certainly had its attractions. By the 1920s, I think there was cause to ponder the consequences of his long spell overseas. His eldest son, St. Ledger, was forced to drop out of Fort Hare shortly before he was due to matriculate, feeling that he had to help his mother and to earn some money to help pay for the family's subsistence. And later on, Plaatje was bitterly disappointed, not only that St. Ledger lost a very good job in Cape Town, but that he and his younger brother, Hallie, when both were back in Kimberley, would sometimes return home worse for the wear after some heavy drinking sessions. Now, for somebody so committed to the cause of temperance, this clearly made for a difficult family situation. And I think it was always difficult for them, to look at it from their point of view, to live in the shadow of so eminent and upright a father. But their situation was clearly worsened by the lack of opportunity and the effects upon their lives of the country's segregationist policies. Of all his children, I think it was his daughter Violet that Plaatje had the easiest relationship with, and she would be the one who did her best to preserve his legacy after his death. Now, still on the personal front, there was also the question of Plaatje's health. This was, in fact, never very robust, and he was often susceptible to illness and confined to bed. In 1918, it was worsened by the effects of the influenza epidemic, and this led to his daughter Olive's death, but it also left him with a weakened heart. "Your heart leaks so badly that we cannot help you," his doctors told him. "All we could do is prescribe something to ease the pain while matters take their course." Now, that was Canada in 1922, and 5 years later, Plaatje wrote that this seemingly brutal frankness was altogether superfluous, for I had already been convinced that the end was not far off. So knowing about this, I think, adds, I suppose, an extra dimension to our understanding of the extraordinarily active and busy and committed life that he led. And there was always an urgency to it, I think, because he knew that his life might be cut short. So let me just show you, I think, the last portrait of Plaatje, taken, pretty close, I think, to the end of his life. When he died, he was 55 years old. I think in this picture, he kind of looks, I would say, more than 55. And I think it was, it was influenza, double pneumonia, and kind of heart failure that in the end killed him. But he didn't look too well to me in this picture. So I hope what I've tried to convey is some idea of both the social and political context in which Plaatje lived his life, and also of the individual experiences and personal qualities which shaped his response to it, I think both as a youngster and as an adult. It was a story of the optimism I think that was possible for Plaatje's generation to feel in the late 19th century Cape Colony, giving way to feelings of rejection and exclusion and a deep sense of injustice as South Africa's rulers set about segregating all spheres of life and excluding them from any meaningful role in their country's affairs. But to be met, in Plaatje's case, with a refusal to be bowed, determined to make the case for the kind of society in which he believed. So more about that in my next lecture. So thank you very much for listening. I think we have some time for questions and discussion, so over to you.
Can you tell me the year in which that court case was decided, the one that he won?
It was in 1898. Yeah, the one in Kimberley. It was recorded. It was certainly recorded in the newspapers. I don't think it didn't appear in the Greek Willan West law reports. I'm not quite sure why, because it was significant. You know, it did have a bearing on the operation of the pass laws. And what was interesting, I think, you know, it was interesting, I think, for a number of reasons. You know, it was one of those many instances where people like Plaatje used the law for their own purposes and won. You know, sometimes the law seemed, well, to us and to them, as a form of oppression, but there were times when it was actually a form of opposing that oppression, and this was one example. What was also interesting was that Plaatje was referring to that case in the 1930s, you know. So, and I don't know whether he'd kept a cutting from 1898 or whether he kind of went to the newspaper to get it. But there was an article that he wrote in 1930, actually, you know, quoting from the Diamond Fields Advertiser. So it was one of those cases where, you know, that did leave quite an impression on him. Thank you.
What about his siblings? You mentioned that, you know, he was in the right place at the right time, so things inspired him to do well. But did his other siblings do well as well, or was he particularly gifted as one of the family?
Yeah, I mean, this is always an interesting question. I think the answer. I mean, what happened to his other siblings? His closest sibling, Elias, was one of the ones who died. He also went to the mission school. He left and got a job with a trader going to Mashonaland, and then came back having picked up some disease, and he died. One of the other siblings, I think when much younger, was drowned in the Val River. Another died from another disease. But there were. I mean, he had what's called six other brothers. None of them went on, you know, to any sort of position of or preeminence as he did. But it's interesting when you know, if you look at so I think, you know, so the answer to your question is, I think Plaatje was particularly gifted, and certainly this was what the missionaries were saying, and you would sort of have expected that, but fortunately, because there's a very rich surviving archive, you know, where I think that, you know, the German missionaries particularly were good at, you know, writing absolutely everything down. So there is actually quite a lot about, you know, what went on that mission. And so when Westfall, you know, does come out and say, you know, yes, Plaatje was the most gifted student I've ever had, well, I think there's no reason to disbelieve him. But I suppose the other point, you know, further to that, is you then think, well, if you look at Plaatje, for example, when he went on to Kimberley, where, you know, when he was with the post office, with, you know, and had a very kind of active social and communal life with a lot of other, you know, young men. I think if you look at the reports that have survived from that, you know, you get the impression, well, there are dozens of these, you know, bright, enthusiastic, articulate, ambitious young men, and, you know, from whom Plaatje, I think, clearly learnt a great deal. But of them, you know, Plaatje was the one who kind of went on and essentially made a name for himself. But I think he wasn't somebody who sort of came from nowhere. You know, sometimes the temptation, where you have a particularly prominent individual, is to look for kind of purely, he was a genius. He was certainly, incredibly, he was hardworking, extremely intelligent, all of that. But he clearly he did come from a much broader culture, and he clearly owed a great deal to a lot of other people as he made his way.
I imagine those siblings didn't have the educational advantages that he had either.
His siblings. Elias did, but he was the one who died. What also happened actually was that the family, when they were at Pineal, they separated. Plaatje remained at Pineal with his elder brother, and his parents essentially left, and his father ended up going further north with some of the other children. And so, those ones didn't end up with the education that Plaatje got at Pineal. Pineal was, it was a kind of very basic primary education, but it was a lot better than, you could get in most other places. Sorry.
It is quite a big family of Plaatjes just to the other side of the Kai River. Georgia, Butterworth, that kind of area, Bizarre and so on. What would their connection be to Sorrowful?
The answer is I don't know. There were certainly other Plaatje families who were no relation. It's not a completely uncommon name. So I'm not aware that family is of the same branch of the Plaatje family. They tended, they were kind of mostly from the kind of northern Cape, eastern sort of Free State region, and then some of them have kind of ended up in Johannesburg and Pretoria. But the answer is I don't know the answer to that. Sorry.
I apologise for a personal question. What set you off on your research on Plaatje?
Okay. I'll tell you what it was. Plaatje's Mafikeng diary was published in 1973, I think, and it was edited by a man called John Komaroff, who was a South African anthropologist who was actually based in Manchester, and I met him in London at that time, just after this book had been published, and I had just done an MA in African studies, so I was interested in these things, and had just had an interest in Plaatje, and sort of got talking to John Komaroff about this, and I thought, oh well, he's done this diary. I expect he'll be, doing more about Plaatje, because he looked on the face of it such an interesting character. But in fact, that wasn't the case. John Komaroff wanted to go off and do other more sort of anthropological things, which he did very successfully. And so it just got me interested to think, well, would it be possible to find out a bit more about this man? Because if you looked in the books that were available at the time, there was very little information at all. So I kind of then just started to, you just have to look at, for example, Plaatje's book Native Life in South Africa, which I'll be talking about tomorrow. There's an awful lot of clues in that as to where you might look if you want to find more, for example, of articles that Plaatje had written in newspapers. So, I kind of started looking, and wherever I looked, kept finding piles of material. So I thought, maybe there was enough to turn this into, to do a PhD based on this. So that's how I got started. My big worry at the beginning was, I suppose any PhD student, is there enough? Is it going to be feasible? Is there going to be enough material to justify a study? But you end up having, in the end, the opposite sort of problem. So that was how I got interested.
That was a really society when we're only publishing your works.
Not this year. Not this year, unfortunately. but I hope next year. And what it is, it's an edited collection of Plaatje's letters. Most of them, about 3/4 of the letters are in English, but about 1/4 of them are in Setswana, and we'll be publishing translations of the Setswana letters in English. So I'm editing this in conjunction with a colleague of mine, Sabata Mokai, at the Sol Plaatje University in Kimberley. So that should be out next year. So there are in existence about